Morning.
Yeah. Good morning. Yay.
Uh, Sorry, I'm a moment late.
No, that's all right. I literally woke up like 3 minutes ago, so I'm a little fuzzy. Have you been up much longer?
I've been up a little bit longer and then didn't realize what time it was.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, I don't like this auto recording stuff. I feel like we have to jump right away, but this is the first time we're having. I don't know. I feel like I want to have casual conversation first to ask who you are,
uh,
but it
yeah.
is recorded. I mean, we could maybe
Uh,
stop it after.
okay, yeah, sure. Let's do that. All right. So, an overview of web monitoring. Um, so to start with, I think the important thing, so I think it's important to keep in mind that we shouldn't be working on it so much as a software project as supporting the analysts who are actually like monitoring websites. So it's helpful to get a sense of how the project and the process of like monitoring started, and what it looks like for the analysts now versus what we're working on in web monitoring dash whatever on GitHub. Um, so originally for analysts, they had have a service called Versionista, which they plugged in a whole bunch of URLs that they got from various academics and also government people who said, "Hey, these pages on various government websites like the DOE or EPA or whatever are important." And so they started monitoring those pages on Versionista, and Versionista will basically ping those pages once a day and look at what it sends back. And if it's different than whatever it got the day before, then it'll log that as a change. And there are a whole bunch of downsides with the way Versionista does it, but it does at least that for them. And so initially, they just got an army of people to kind of comb through Versionista, which was a mess. So somebody before I got involved with the project helped to write a script to scrape stuff out of Versionista because, of course, Versionista has no API. So hilariously, we are writing a scraper to scrape the scraper. Um, so basically, what the script does is a Ruby script that would go through and it would attempt to pull out all the pages that had a change in the last X hours. So pretty much because there are so many pages to monitor and it takes a while, they would do it in 3-day chunks. So they would pull out every change over a 72-hour period, and it would dump those into a CSV file. And then somebody would upload all those CSV files to Google Spreadsheets, and then analysts would run through all the spreadsheets and annotate every page with like 20 different annotations about ways that it has changed or ways that that change might be significant. And so that's important because a lot of changes are like minor copy edits and it's not really a big deal versus a change that's like materially changing the character of like what the text is saying. But also one of the big problems, and the problem they were having trouble with when I first got involved, like a month and a half ago, is that because Versionista is really naive about what it considers a change, it's anything that was different. And sometimes that's like, oh, the URL for the style sheet of the page got tweaked, and that's a change, which is really pointless. But sometimes it's equally mundane, but it is text where like the footer of the page will have like the date. It'll say like today is Tuesday, January 3rd. And the next time Versionista hits the page, it'll say today is Wednesday, January 4th, which is a change, but not one that we care about at all. And so at the time, they got a bunch of people together, and a lot of those people were very interested in how to use like machine learning or other complicated techniques to identify meaningful changes. But the problem is it's really hard to do any of that if the way you're getting that data is running a very slow scraping job that takes 8 hours to run 72 hours worth of data out of the system. So kind of job one was to move that thing from scraping randomly into a CSV file on somebody's hard drive that then somebody manually updates, to putting it into a database and also having it run sort of regularly and hopefully more frequently. So you could query that database for any time period you care, but it's always up to date. It's not like every 3 days suddenly a gajillion changes drop in. So out of that, like the web monitoring GitHub software projects were born. And some of the older projects that were floating around have sort of been renamed or reworked to fit under that. So then it's helpful to kind of look at github.com/.
Mind if the word analyst gets used a lot? Is that encompasses a large number? Like, it's not just journalists.
It's a very fancy term, and it's just somebody who's looking at a page and analyzing the content of the change. Most of those people, as far as I'm aware, are students, usually like undergrad or grad students, because most of the EDGE organization has grown out of sort of the academic hard science, physical sciences disciplines. So a lot of the people who initially got involved and could volunteer some time on the side were students.
Okay, so it's not, the analysts aren't the ones often writing the larger stories. They just kind of flag it and pass it off to.
So the way the process tends to work, and Toli or Andrew can speak way more to this than I can, because I've mostly focused on the technical software stuff. But so analysts, which are really just anybody who's volunteering, and a lot of them are students, run through and flag all the pages, and then those wind up getting sent to the ones that are flagged as significant go to a second spreadsheet. That's sort of a second review to see how significant, to sort of like tag them and categorize them. And then the analysts or other people will do a write-up and a report, and they'll send that report out to various news agencies like Washington Post or Climate Watch or New York Times or wherever. And then it's up to reporters there to take that sort of fairly technical, kind of wonky report that we write and turn it into a sensational like thing for the public. So that's kind of how the process goes. It's sort of like we put out a press release about a change, and then a newspaper picks it up and writes more anecdotally about it. So let's see, how do I share my screen? Whoa, I got a lot of windows to choose from. Okay, so can you see my screen now? Awesome. So we're looking at the main web monitoring repository. So back when I first started getting involved in this, and we started to say, okay, we need a database, we need to build out the software a little bit more, a whole lot of people were involved. So we wanted to try and split up the pieces of work into separate projects, so it was easy for lots of different people to work at once. So they all live under the EDGE Gov Data Archiving org. And the web monitoring project is sort of the umbrella project. There's not really any code in it. It's just sort of a description of what all the other things are. So you have a sort of overview. So you can kind of go through this, and it talks a little bit about the project goals, which is to help those analysts do their job better. One of which is to get better archiving of everything. Another of which is to help better filter those changes. Another of which is to give them a better user interface than spreadsheets, and one that's less error prone. And another of which is to sort of get better data than we get out of Versionista, because there's some limitations in what Versionista gives us. And hopefully by having a more generic database, we'll be able to start bringing in data from other services. For example, you might have heard Page Freezer thrown around, which is a company that does something sort of like Versionista, but they're more focused on sort of archiving. So they just crawl a whole site and archive it, and they don't really have a whole user interface, and it's not focused around changes over time. It's just archives at points in time. Because their main use case, as far as I'm aware, is to sort of keep archives of like social media things or whatever for companies, where like if some tweet or something gets deleted, you have an archive of like what actually happened at various points in time. So they're not focused so much on changing, but on archiving, but they do a much more thorough, heavy duty job of that archiving. And if we can bring that into our database, then we can turn those archives into a focus on changes. Anyway, so that's an aside about PageFreezer, but there are a plethora of services like that. PageFreezer has donated some stuff to Edgy. So hopefully we can get that moving into the database, and we'll have better data than we get out of Versionista.
Don't they, I was kind of looking through their docs, and it seems like it's like PDFs only that you download. Is that like, so it's going to be diffing PDFs?
No, PageFreezer. So I haven't dealt a whole lot with their public thing, but what they have set up sort of a, not really on site, but within Edgy's Google Cloud project. So they've set up a series of virtual servers and virtual disks that run their entire software stack internally for us. That's just ours. And that builds these like archive files, and you can pull out HTML or PDF or whatever kind of content through that archive file. So it's much more than PDFs. I haven't dug into the PageFreezer stuff a whole lot yet, and Dan has been focusing more on that. I don't think there are any limitations on the types of files or the size of files or the content within PageFreezer. Versionista, for example, one of its big limitations is it will only store certain kinds of files. So it will store HTML and it will store PDFs, but it won't store MP3s. So we'll have like a listing for the page in Versionista, and it'll say this is whatever .mp3, but it won't store the content, so we can't pull the content back out and compare it. It would be hard to compare MP3s anyway. We would have to, they haven't been doing that work, and it would be a lot of work to figure out the right way to do it. But images and all kinds of other things. PageFreezer or Versionista will store small images, but won't store big ones. Generically, if a file is more than, I think it's somewhere around 2 megabytes, maybe it's 5 megabytes. If the content is larger than that, it simply won't store it. So we'll have these records when we scrape Versionista that say, here's a page, but here's no data about that page. We just know that it existed, and the first time we looked at it was this date, and we kept looking at it every day, but we can't tell you anything about what happened every day, which is kind of frustrating. So one of the goals with other services is to be able to get better results than that for things that aren't just simple, small HTML pages. So anyway, those are all sort of like the major goals of the web monitoring software side, is to do those things to better support the analysts. So there's a whole lot about that up here at the top in the project overview. And then there's a little definition of terms here, which are kind of important. The first two are really straightforward: page and version. So page is a URL, basically. It's a web page somewhere. And it could actually be a PDF, or it could be HTML, or it could be an image, but those are all pages, right? They're URLs on the web. And a version is just the state of that page at some point in time. Because we can't know when somebody changes it. We attempt to hit those pages as often as possible through Versionista or PageFreezer or whatever. And we only try and capture a new version if it was different, sort of like Versionista does. Versus PageFreezer, which just says, here's the archive for this week. And then next week it does, here's the archive for next week. And it has no concept of only storing the things that were different from the previous week. We care about only the things that are different. So a version is a version that is necessarily different from the previous version. And then
is the diff format that they're using some sort of standard, or is it something that, if we build something to that, they might change it without too much announcement?
Versionista's diff format?
PageFreezer has no diff format, I guess. Is that it? Okay.
Yeah. So you might have heard in Slack some people talk about PageFreezer's diffs. So Page Freezer also has a tool which is actually pretty much totally disconnected from their archival system that will do diffs. And Dan has looked at it. I have not looked at it at all. It does some clever things about how it does the diff. But so like if you give it an HTML page, it'll give you, it'll pay a little bit more attention to how the DOM is structured in terms of how it builds the diff instead of just like running, diff on the command line on Unix. And it'll give you back like a JSON object with the different chunks of the diff as different objects in the JSON. So you can do a lot more with it more easily. You don't have to sort of parse it in the same way. But that thing is entirely disconnected from the archive. So when you use it, you say, here's the content of version 1, here's the content of version 2, diff them for me. It doesn't have a way to say like, oh, like diff this page from this date versus this page from this date, and it'll go dig through the archives and do that. It's totally disconnected. It's an independent thing. In some people tested it over Page Freezer's sort of like publicly available stuff, and it was super slow. But I don't think anybody spent the time to figure out whether that was more their network latency or other issues or something else. And so we're hoping that the one in our internal install will be faster and we'll be able to use it because people seem to like the way it formatted the output. But we don't know if that's actually the case yet. I haven't played with it, and I don't know that. Doesn't sound like Dan has yet. We're hoping also, so I should actually, let's flip the screen to Versionista so you can see what Versionista looks like. So this is a page in Versionista. So it gives you kind of a chart over time of every time that it logged a change. So this page changed pretty much every day, which most likely means, oh, this is my example of a ridiculously bad page, actually. So we know also that Versionista, it'll tell us if the server returned an error code when it requested the page. And in looking at a lot of these, frequently the issue is that Versionista will hit a server too hard, and eventually it'll start responding with errors. And because the error looks different than the content of the page, it looks change. So in this one, you'll see a whole lot of versions. Every day there was a version, and most of them are errors. And if you were to compare May 10th with May 2nd, they are exactly the same. So there's not really a diff here.
Is it just like that there's like some throttling going on? Like it's just like recognizing it's blocking this IP for like a bunch of days, or?
I can't say for sure, both because I don't know exactly how Versionista scrapes, but also every site is a different web server and may respond differently. So we've seen ones where they'll respond with, so there's one web server, I think it's a DOE that has McAfee something protection. And at a certain point, we start getting some of the pages in Versionista will be like a 403 page, and it will specifically say like McAfee protection has limited requests from your IP, blah, blah, blah. And it'll say a little bit of details about that. And it's basically saying you are unauthorized for the next hour, and so we know a whole bunch of pages are basically shot from that scraper run, which is unfortunate. But let's go look at a different page that's less insane. So in Versionista, you get a list of sites. So we could look at like any part of the NOAA. And then you get a list of all the pages that are being tracked. So if we just pick one at random. Yeah, so this one isn't full of errors, so that's good. So you can see kind of a chart over time, but then you can just see a list of all the versions. Typically, Versionista hits a page once a day. So you'll see that these are more or less all 24 hours apart. And you can look at the content of a version if you click on it. So you can see what that page looks like today. where you can see what the page looked like, a couple months ago. Which is fairly similar. Or you can do a comparison. So if an analyst was looking at this, what they would do is they'd click on the compare link. And actually, we have this link in the spreadsheet that they use on Google Docs. So theoretically, they never really come to this page anymore. They just click that link, which is the same as clicking this link here. And that'll give you, by default, a side-by-side view of the two pages. And it attempts to highlight, what's different. So this is probably sort of a summary page of things. And so it's just going to have different reports every day highlighted down here. And that's all that's changing. So it might not be particularly important, but this is kind of the tip view. Versionista provides several ways to look at the diff, right? So you can look at side-by-side visually. You can look at side-by-side like this, but without it attempting to highlight what's changed. You can look at a single page. You can look at two screenshots side-by-side. You can look at a formatted source of the current version. You can look at just the changes in the source, which is kind of like just running a diff on the command line between two HTML files, except it doesn't give you line numbers and things like that, which is both a help and a problem. So it's a little bit specific about this particular page, but if you have two pages that have changed in more or less the same way, but the textual content on them is different, so the line numbers of those changes would be different, even though the changes are the same, they'll look like the same change in here, which is actually helpful for us, which is kind of funny. It's less technically correct, but it's actually advantageous. And then you can also look at just the text and the changes only in that text, or all of the text. So I think most of the time the analysts have found the text views, so text and text changes only, and the source changes only views to be the helpful ones, mostly because they got to check the source ones occasionally, because sometimes that's a meaningful change, but most of the time they might check the text and there seems to be no change, and they'll look at the source and they'll see that there was a small source code change. So it's helpful to sort of clarify for them what happened when just looking at the text can be ambiguous. So Versionista provides a lot of different ways to look at the change, which is actually helpful and valuable for the analysts. And one of the things we hope to be able to reproduce is that. So when we're working on giving them a better UI, it's not just a better way to run through every page and annotate it, but it's also a better way to look at what changed between any two given versions. And so that is also should be a separate kind of project. We want to have sort of diff services that are their own web monitoring, whatever diff, so we'd love to have people like help just do that, which is a good, like, small focused problem. What are like novel or useful ways to diff two web pages that are especially useful for like our use case of comparing sort of changes in language over time. So that gives you a little bit of an idea, hopefully, of like how Versionista works and how the analysts use Versionista.
Was there any cooperation with Versionista?
Sorry.
No, just whether like they were asked to like implement some of these things that like were holding everyone back, or whether it's just, they're not even in communication, or.
So my understanding is that there's sort of like very minimal communication. Mm-hmm. So they attempted to talk with Versionista a little bit early on, and they sort of like got some help and support, but not a lot. And my understanding is that it seemed like the Versionista folks were pretty busy trying to support a whole lot of other customers, probably who could afford to pay more, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And so and in communication with them just sort of dropped off. And I'm not sure whether that's more on our side or more on their side. It's probably a little bit from both. But I would say overall, they have not been super responsive to like changing things or building out new things for us.
Okay.
And so, one of the other helpful things about this overall project is to give us more flexible approaches that aren't just stuck to whatever versionista can do.
Yeah, I will admit I'm really intrigued by that. Like, it seems like Page Freezer doesn't do a super critical part, but it's like it actually like kind of makes us consider, oh, what do we build? And now there's a little piece that kind of we own, which is very exciting and probably more in the direction that, that the community should go in. So, yeah, I'm sure you guys are all thinking about that. That's
yeah. So that's Page Freezer. So you have a sense of like what those diffs are like. So coming back to sort of those terms, so we've got page and version. We've got a sense of like the kind of diffs people are looking at in Page Freezer, what we'd like to be able to reproduce or maybe do better than. And we had this sense of a diff sort of being that in the web monitoring system. Initially, we had an idea that we were going to like store diffs as a thing. And I think the way we're going right now is more, we want to have sort of a constellation of services that can do diffs. And we probably aren't going to like store them, because what we found is it's actually important to be able to do more than just the diff between, the most recent and the previous. So it's not practical to say like generate every diff ahead of time. One of the reasons is like if a scraper hits a server too hard and starts getting error pages, probably you don't, as an analyst, want to look at the diff between the current version and the last one, which was an error. You want to look at the diff between the current version and the last one that was not an error. So you might want to skip several in between. So it's hard for us to even necessarily say ahead of time what is the relevant sort of two versions to diff between. One of the great things that as we get better data and sort of structure it in the database is that maybe we'll be able to be smarter ahead of time about what the right sort of diff to start with is. But right now we're just trying to tackle having everything in a structured, straightforward way first. And so diff is in here because we originally thought it would be a whole thing that we store, and now it's going to probably be a more ephemeral thing. So it's sort of less important in the definition of terms. But going with that sense of sort of the diff between version 5, the latest, and instead of version 4, version 3, is this idea of a change. And so what we're talking about when we say change in this whole system is basically just 2 versions. Right. So whereas we have a page and versions of that page, a change is just a set of 2 versions, right? So we're saying a change from version 3 to version 5.
So I guess the distinction seems a little fuzzy for me. Is there like a change? Does the page, does a version imply that it's different? It's not just a scraping run. It's like a scrape and it's recognized that the diff is different. So it's like, hey, this is a new version that we're going to make note of, yeah. Yes.
So in our system, we're trying to make the implication that a version is necessarily different. It's not just a snapshot. It is a snapshot that was different from the previous snapshot. Yeah, and then so change is helpful to say. A change is specifically a change between 2 versions, and it's not necessarily one version and its next version. It could be between 1 version and 5 versions up. So change is basically just a way of tying 2 versions together, right? And so diffs are sort of a property of a change. And what we also have are annotations. And annotations are the way that we're modeling what analysts have to say about a change, basically. So this version of the page was a significant change, and it changed, the wording of like global warming to like climate effects or something, an annotation would be stuff talking about something like that. And the way everything's structured right now in the spreadsheet, these are 20 columns. In each column represents a different thing. So there's the first 6 are sort of categorization of the page. Like, is this page about a department, or is it about a program, or is it about like a person, or is it about climate in general, or whatever? And then there's a whole series about the significance of the change, and then there's a whole series of them that are about the particular sort of nature of the change as opposed to its significance. So what kind of subject matter changed, kind of. But that has changed over time. And so what we're trying to do in the database is consider the content of that annotation, those 20 fields, to be kind of freeform. So in the database, it's modeled. We've got a couple pieces of metadata, which is like the person who made the annotation, the change or the 2 versions that the annotation is relative to, the time the annotation was made at. But then the annotation block itself is just sort of a free-form JSON object, and it could be anything. So it's up to sort of whatever UI somebody is using to interact with the database to figure out how to structure and save that annotation. Because we expect that the content of those will change over time. So we can't sort of predict the fields that you'll need. So those are kind of the major terms that get thrown around a lot that have important particular technical meanings in web monitoring, is page, version, change, and annotation. And diff sort of, but I think diff is pretty colloquially understandable. It's less a particular thing than we initially thought it was going to be. And right now there are actually 4 major projects. There are only 3 listed here. I have a PR to add the 4th. So web monitoring DB is basically a Rails app that serves as an API to the database where we're actually storing everything. So it's an easy REST API to get data out, to make annotations on the database, to make annotations on a change, and also has endpoints for importing new data. The idea there is that API can act as an easier way to interact with the database. It can also control sort of permissions and access, so somebody can't change things, so we can sort of reliably maintain that versions, once they're put in, are never altered. We can only add annotations to those versions, but we never change anything about the version record. Stuff like that. So we can guarantee integrity by putting an API in front of that database. We probably, one of the bugs, one of the issues on DB is to sort of add sort of exported backups that are publicly available and things. So if people want to just pull the whole database down and work through it offline and do more complicated queries, that would then be possible for them, that aren't easy for us to make doable on an API level. But anyway, so that's DB. So it's doesn't really have a UI that's meant to be meaningful. It's just data storage and retrieval and access control. UI, web monitoring UI, is meant to be a better front end for interacting with that database. So in theory, this is a thing that should replace the spreadsheets from the analyst's perspective. They'll use the UI to work through changes and annotate those changes and view diffs rather than Google spreadsheets. And then web monitoring processing is meant to sort of be an umbrella project that controls all the backend pieces that might be pulling data out of a system like Versionista or Page Freezer or say the Internet Archive or whatever, but also to control the set of services and servers that might be doing any kind of machine analysis that we want to enable, because once it's in a database, processing can sort of watch data for updates and new versions through a series of filters or something that might be able to sort of pre-annotate it and say, well, this one was probably not important because of such heuristics. And we might have a whole series of those that sort of work as a pipeline to sort of pre-review a version. So an analyst might be able to just skip it, or it might help them know something about it ahead of time to speed along their analysis. So processing is sort of meant to coordinate like a whole fleet of whatever sort of services people might build to improve the analysis process. UI is the way people interact with it. DB is the data storage. The fourth project, oops, sorry.
Oh, I was just wondering what is processing kind of this, like, this is space for more complex things we'll do later, or is it doing, is the first version doing things?
It's not really doing things right now. It's more of the space and the tool where Dan has been sort of noodling around with some of the page freezer stuff and other things. It is more amorphous right now, whereas DB has sort of taken structure and shape at this point. Processing is not at that point. It's more just the idea of coordination of stuff. That's what processing is. And there's a fourth project, which is web monitoring versionista scraper, which is the actual service that sits out on an EC2 server on Amazon, and every half an hour scrapes everything new out of versionista and sends it to web monitoring DB. It started life as a rewrite of the existing scraper, which is called versionista outputter. For a while after I wrote web monitoring scraper, the web monitoring analysis team was still using CSV's output by the old Ruby script. They're now using ones from this new rewrite because it's much faster. Whereas the old processing script, the old Ruby script would take, it would take 8 hours overnight to pull out 3 days worth of data. The new one does it in about 40 minutes. So, and the new one is also able to just run on a server. So in fact, where until like 2 weeks ago, the person managing all the volunteer analysts would have to literally open their computer at night and run the script, and in the morning pick up the results or deal with the fact that it broke overnight and try and figure out how to fix it. Now it just emails them every 3 days in the morning, so they don't have to actually do anything. So web monitoring scraper, versionista scraper, both sits there and it every 3 days pulls out 3 days worth of data, formats them as CSVs, and sends them to the analysis team. But it is also the thing that every half an hour runs through and pulls out a more like structured view of the data and sends it to DB. So it does both of those tasks. It does everything that we do with pulling stuff out of versionista. And there's a PR for adding that to this list. Hopefully it'll show up soon so that people will see it. That thing would be nice for people to help with, but it might not be critical because our end goal is to sort of depend on versionista less. So probably the end goal for that scraper is for it to disappear. But for now, it's pretty important. It might be the most important piece of the workflow at the current moment. So that's kind of an overview of all the different software projects that are involved. So does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. And sorry, was the differ known? Is that something that you touched on, and it just had a different name, or?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I didn't. So web monitoring differ is one person wrote that like right around the time this stuff got started, a month and a half or 2 months ago. And it was pretty much totally uncoordinated with the rest of it. And it hasn't seen an update since then. I think Dan was trying to get a hold of Wesley, who's the person who wrote it. And I don't know sort of what his status is, if he's lost the ability to have time to work on it or the interest or whatever, because I don't feel like we've had a whole lot of discussion about it since then. So that's kind of why it's floating off here a little bit separate, because it's a little less coordinated with the rest of the work. But it is sort of the first of the idea of like a diffing service that UI might use to display two versions from DB. And we hope, since DB is providing a nice fancy REST API, one of the things we would like DB to do is broker between UI and the diffing services. So the UI can just ask DB for a kind of diff, and it will go off and retrieve it from the diffing service and give it back in a semi-standard format. But yeah, web monitoring differ is sort of the first super early implementation of what a diffing service might be. And it's just a web service that you give 2 pages and it gives you back a diff. So there's nothing very fancy about it, but it's a first example, I guess.
Cool.
Okay.
Actually, I'll hold my questions to the end, actually, because it's kind of just a nebulous, floating, detached question.
Yeah, no worries. So does that kind of clarify the overall project? And I'll dive into DB in particular now.
It does. Yeah. This is helpful.
Okay. Oh, one minor note before I do that. Web monitoring UI, this link points to the edgy GovData archiving org web monitoring UI, which you will notice if we follow it has not been updated in a couple months. Kevin, Light and Luck on GitHub and on Slack, did a little bit more work on a fork, which is, I think, slightly more up to date. So if you want the latest of his work, it, I don't think, has been merged back into the main one yet. So just worth noting. Hopefully we'll fix that soon. So web monitoring DB. So like I said before, this is a Rails app, and it basically serves as an API on top of the database. The documentation here is unfortunately a little bit thin. It helps you get it running, but it doesn't tell you much about like how to use it. That's sort of one of my next tasks to improve. But let's see if we can pull up the pull request where we totally reorganized and built the current API. So there's this pull request, which is a helpful one to reference if trying to understand what the API for DB is. So about 3/4 of the way down the page, there's sort of a long comment by me, which summarizes where we are so far. Okay. And so that's a good place to go to get an overview of the current API. So if anybody's interested in helping to document that stuff, this is a good place to start. You know, because we need to get this in a more obvious and visible place. But basically, if you go to web monitoring DB, currently lives at web-monitoring-db.herokuapp.com. So let's do the herokuapp.com. Oh, geez. And so it'll give you on the page like sort of a semi-friendly formatted version of the API. But if you want to see what the API is actually responding, everything is at /API/v0, because it's kind of, right now we're considering it to be in flux until there's sort of a workable version of the UI that analysts are using. V0 is the signifier that like we might change things around totally if we need to better serve the UI. And that's going to be our sort of guide star for what the right API is as the UI develops. But the main endpoint is this /pages one. And all the responses that you'll get are formatted as an object with links and with data. And if it's a list of things, links will be paging related links. So it'll be first the URL of the first page, the URL of the last page, and then URL for the next and previous. So if I were to say page equals 2, now you'll see that previous is filled in, you know. But basically, you can just follow these links if you're trying to page through the results, so you don't necessarily need to know the right queries to make for paging. You can just follow those links. And then data will be an array of all the actual results. So what a page looks like is a UUID that identifies the page, the URL of the page, the title of the page, the agency that page belongs to, and the sort of the website the page belongs to. There's a couple pages, and it's like 4 or 5 in the whole system that are categorized in multiple sites, because the site piece of information comes from Versionista. And site is not really a domain or anything technical. It's just a category. And it's human managed. So a couple of pages exist in multiple sites. We're probably going to get rid of this one or turn it into something like a tag. So this might be a less formal thing that you'll see on each record. Agency will probably stick around. And then there's created at and updated at, which are really database centric. They don't have anything to do with like the last time that we captured the page or anything like that. Updated at will be the last time that we imported a version for this page. But otherwise, you probably don't care about created at and updated at. And then you'll see latest, which is a link, which is a reference to the latest version of this page. If you took the UUID for this page and you went directly to it, so you did pages / that ID, instead of latest, so you'd see the exact same page record, but instead of latest, you'd see versions, which would be a list of all the versions, latest first. But if you're looking at a list of page results, you only get latest, which is the latest version. But the thing that's in latest is exactly the same as the thing that you get here in this list of versions.
Is the UUID like, so I think I'm still, so is a lot of this content generated from the page, the Versionista import that you said is temporarily running and pulling things into this system?
Yes. So all this data that's in a live system is coming from that Versionista scraper. So it's all only Versionista data right now. You'll see that there's this source type and source metadata field. So when we start getting things from PageFreezer, we'll have some records that are source type Versionista, which we got from Versionista, and some that are source type PageFreezer, which means they came from PageFreezer. The idea is this could be anything. We want to probably pull in things from Internet Archive also, at least. But you know, this just identifies basically how you should read the source metadata part, which is just a blob of anything that's relevant beyond the basics that's specific to the source we pulled this from. You know, so Versionista will have its own IDs for everything, and it generates its own kind of diff. So we have information about Versionista's diff, but you know, that may not be a set of fields that's relevant to something coming from PageFreezer or some other system.
So should I expect, like, I think I was like seeing the diff things in this system, which I guess in my brain, this didn't have diffs yet. Those are all going to be kind of like ad hoc fields that are only from Versionista, and it's nothing.
Yeah, everything in source metadata is relatively ad hoc. We want to try and make sure it's the same set of fields for a given source type. So any Versionista version will have the same fields in source metadata. So you can sort of think of it as structured, but there's no guarantee on that. And the goal is that it should be different metadata for Page Freezer or Internet Archive or wherever.
Cool.
Yeah. But this gives us a couple of pieces of information that are kind of really important for analysts right now. So if we just built a UI that mostly mimicked the spreadsheets, which is kind of where we're starting, they need to know the account, because there's actually 2 Versionista accounts, because you can only track so many pages in a given account. And so the analysts need to know which account the page came from, so they know which one to log into to actually view the diff, because we don't really have a meaningful diff implementation right now, so they need Versionistas. And then the URL to that diff, to look at. So we store a URL for the diff with the previous version and the diff with the very first captured version in Versionista. But they can totally change the diff that they're looking at once they get there. This is just helpful, like what would we link them to from the UI? So this is just kind of useful metadata for us. But yeah, like I said, it will be different for different services, because none of those things will be relevant for, say, Page Freezer or Internet Archive. And hopefully in the future, when we do our own diffing and everything else, none of these things will really be relevant at all, except as sort of auditing, right? So we have an idea of where it came from. So anyway, the really salient things for versions are versions also have a UUID. And then they have the page that they're associated with, and then the time that they were captured at. So this time field is important, and it's just the time that Versionista captured the page, not the time that we scraped it from Versionista. So it's the time at which the content that we have was actually captured. And then URI is important to remember. This URI is a very different thing from the page's URL. The version URI is where you can get the raw content of that version. So if you wanted to see what the page looked like at the capture time, go to this URI. It's not the page on the internet that the version is of. It's the actual content of that page at that point in time. So this is sort of an archival file versus URL for a page being the page that we're capturing versions of. And then hash is SHA-256 hash of the content of the page, which is helpful because one of the things we noticed recently when the EPA started overhauling its website, they blew away pretty much all the pages under epa.gov/climate change. And all of those URLs now redirect to one page. And so since we have the hash, it was one of the nice things about that was it was very easy to identify all the pages that were removed and redirected, because we could just query the database for all the versions that have this particular hash.
So it's not just the hash, like, is it somehow related to all the content in the snapshot, or is it just the HTML page? Or like if someone, if they, an image or something, or a linked PDF was updated, I don't know. I think, yeah. Is it like is it a tree? Does it encompass all the media artifacts inside, or is it just the HTML page?
It is just the HTML page. So if the page was actually a PDF, it'll be a hash of the PDF. But if it was like a normal web page, it's just a hash of the page source code itself. It's not a hash of like the source code combined with all the images used and everything else.
Yeah, which 99.9% of the use cases covers everything. Like, I can't imagine an image changing but staying the same file name happening that often, and needing to be found.
Although that is a good point, like there might be value in having sort of a hash of like, if you could archive the page and all the things used to render it, hashing that would be possibly also interesting and useful. But that's not what it is right now. It's a hash of the actual response we got back from the server. So if it's a web page, it's just the source code of that page.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So for the most part, we can tell if two pages or two versions were exactly the same by looking at the hash. And then there's created at and updated at, which just like the ones for page, probably most of the time you don't care about. Those are a little bit more for sort of technical maintenance and audit purposes because they have to do with when we put the record in our database.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last one is current annotation. So like we talked about before, annotations are about a change, which is a set of two versions, and there might be many annotations for a version. The idea of current annotation is it's just kind of a roll-up summary of all the annotations that were made against this version. So all the annotations where the end version was this particular version, we sort of wrap them all up into one object. So like if 3 annotations were made on this version and they all annotated the same field, like say the field was like subject matter and it was climate, the annotation what we'd have in here would be an object that looks exactly like any one of those 3 annotations, but it would have the fields from sort of the latest annotation. So it's sort of the quick and dirty way to get sort of the summary of what everybody said about a page. But if you really want to see individually what each person said, in case they said something different, and you need to figure that out, there's a different API to actually get the list of all the annotations.
Is it possible to like view one easily that has annotations? I think it's still a little fuzzy on what this format would be. Not that if you don't think it's important, we can totally skip, but like the way you just described it didn't really click with an understanding that I have.
Yeah, I should have queued this up ahead of time. I think on staging, well, on production, we might have, I think there's a couple annotations. So let me, give me just a minute.
Yeah, no problem.
What happened?
And if it's not easy to pull up, like we could just like address it after the video call or something, whichever you think is better.
No, that's a really good and important question. So I want to try and address it, and it should just take me a minute. There aren't any in that database. Let me see if there are any in staging right now. Okay, there is a solution for this. Place. Sorry, this will take me just a minute.
No, that's all right.
Okay. All right. Now we should be able to look at my local. Hold on. Perfect. Yes. Okay. So we've got some annotations here. So this will be web monitoring DB dev API zero changes / okay. So better actually. So we were looking at pages. Dot. Okay. So let's go through the sort of main API if you were digging down piece by piece. So if your page's particular page is one that has annotations in my local test database. It loads. There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as we scroll down, yeah, so you can see this one, this version, has current annotation, has a few things in it. And so if we were to look at this version, so we'd say /versions, if we wanted to get a list of all the versions for the page.
Okay.
And then you can get a particular version. And so we'll see just that same thing that we just looked at. And then you can go to /annotations and get a list of all the annotations on that version. So you'll see here, there's actually 5 annotations. But current annotation just sort of has a summary of those values. Okay, so this has...
Sorry. Like, where is the key coming from? Like some like is it just the source that it's coming from, or like what's
right. So
like how is this coming up at being entered? I guess.
Yeah. So let me just roll back to how this gets summarized briefly, right? So if you post an annotation, so there's a post HTTP post endpoint. Which is actually this endpoint. So API v0 pages, page ID /version /version ID /annotations. And if you post to that, basically you post this JSON object, which can have anything you want in it.
Okay.
And an annotation record will then be made attached to the latest and previous versions of this page. And it'll give it a created at, updated at time. It'll log who you were that made the annotation. So the author of the annotation, you have to be logged in order to post an annotation.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else, you don't have to be logged in to read data out of the system, but to post an annotation, you have to be logged in. And then the versions it was related to, which we'll come back to in a bit, because there's a way to post annotations on not just the difference between the current and previous version, but between several back. But the simple way, if you just do this, just adds an annotation to the current version versus the previous.
Okay.
And so that annotation can be is a JSON object. It can have any values you want in it, just any set of key value pairs, as long as it can be serialized as JSON. And so what happened here is that I posted several annotations. So this one, it has a field called test API old. This one has test API 1. This has test API 1. You'll see these have different values. Same as this one. You can have many keys and values in one annotation. I guess I did not do that here when I was poking around testing at things. So it's not a great example, but so if we compare that sort of side by side to the summarized one you get when you just look at the version. So you see it only has the 3 different fields that were used across all 5 of those annotations. So it's test API 1, test item, test API old. So those are all the fields that were posted across all the annotations that people made. And the value is sort of the value from the latest annotation.
Okay.
So the idea is that gives you sort of a summary view of what everybody said, sort of glommed together. But if you really want to know individually what things were said at each time somebody annotated something, you want to actually ask for the list of all annotations. So this is sort of a
Okay.
more detailed view versus this is a quick summary. It's probably useful most of the time, but not perfect.
Okay.
So skipping back slightly.
And like in practice, like it's kind of like one person who's claimed this. It's not like the annotations are kind of simple. Like it's just like the equivalent of what used to be like comments on a spreadsheet sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Where like one per item, like just whoever posts there is the one that stays there. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's free form. It's whatever anybody has to say about a change between any two given versions. And you'll see here, the same author made all of these annotations. Our initial idea was that annotations would be like an append only thing so that you could have sort of a nice audit trail. But the reality is like that makes the UI more painful because then you have to have like a commit button. And so one of the next changes I'm planning to make is that annotations will be editable. So there will only ever be one annotation per change per user. Right? So multiple people can still make annotations. A change like this could still have 5 annotations, but it would never have 5 with the same author ID the way this one does. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the API is not going to change at all. It's just if you post a second annotation, it'll just update your previous one instead of adding a new one. But anyway, so the important thing coming back here is this annotation has a from version and a to version. So even though we sort of said, well, give me this particular version's annotations, all the annotations are actually from one version to another. And in this case, it's from the previous version to the current version. But these are arbitrary. And so the more complicated way to look at annotations and to post annotations that aren't just about the current and previous is to go to, let's make a new tab, is to go to, instead of /pages, oh no. So this is going to change. But right now it's a particular page /changes, and then you look at the version you're going from, the version you're going to. And so then you can see the same list of annotations that way. What's useful about this is it allows us to sort of go back here and look at our list of all versions. So these annotations are all from 603977 to B47830. And I think I've got some annotations on here. So B4, yeah. So this is the to version. And then you can see the from version on there that we were looking at is the previous one. But I think there are also some annotations from the version before that. So if we wanted to change sort of the range that we're looking at, oh, nope, there aren't. Let me see which ones there are. Annotation.
Oh, I was talking and I was muted. Uh,
Oh,
I was so the annotations can be over a range, like presumably to say, oh, these are all errors or something. Like, but if I like choose a version that is inside and I'm like want to let the list of annotations, like yeah, just this is I feel like I'm asking an obvious question, but like, is it like checking against all each annotation covers a list, a range? Is my change that is not in the to or the from, but it's like somewhere in between that chain, that list of diffs? Is the annotation going to show up as like for that page when?
so uh, it's a little complicated. So an annotation or change is necessarily has a from and a to, but that's not really a range. So it's not like when we say changes from dot 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 to slash annotations, we don't get, say, all the annotations that are within that range. We're only asking for the annotations that are in particular attached to these two versions.
Okay.
Um, because the idea there is like, say there was an error in the middle and there was an annotation on it that just said, this is an error page. You probably wouldn't want to see that if you're looking at the annotations from the version before that error and the version after that error.
Yeah.
So they aren't really a range so much as they are an identifier of the two things being compared.
Okay.
If that
Okay.
makes sense.
Gotcha.
They
That
do they
that
do
does.
have to be sequential, right? So the one you list first has to have been a version that came before the one you list second, but they're not really
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
They're
Okay.
more of a they're a comparison. This is like A and B that I'm comparing, not really a range of time.
That makes sense. I'm glad I asked because I definitely had that tweaked wrong in my head. Um, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no worries. Um, so so realistically, when we first added this, this idea that there was a difference between like uh, annotations between two arbitrary versions versus just an annotation of the current version, which is sort of the current versus the previous. Uh, that was Dan's really good insight, and at the time I thought, nah, that's just too complicated and it's not going to be useful. And then we discovered the situation where pages occasionally error out, and realistically, actually, you want to be able to do this a lot. And so that current annotation idea is really based around the older idea I had, where most of the time you don't care about this, you just want to see the current versus the previous. So we might change how that current annotation part works. It's a little fuzzy because that came before the learning of having an annotation that's just a comparison of two arbitrary versions is actually really important. But yeah, uh, so that's why like current might seem weird in the context of actually an annotation is between two versions, and current makes it look like it's just an annotation of the current version.
Is there a talk of like this is kind of a little bit further out, but it was before. Uh, I guess when you're showing that error page and sorry, when you're showing the versionista listings and all the errors that sometimes happen, um, and also talking about how some diffs like are happening at places in the DOMs that are totally not interesting. Like, are you hoping when you guys put together the full, or like when we put together the full suite of things, that there'll be like ignore patterns for like when certain error codes, like when a certain error code or like a certain like string is recognized on the page, it's just kind of like dropped and a snapshot isn't taken, or like blacklists or whitelists for like areas of the DOM to like only look at or to ignore, or is that yeah
Um,
that's like not in the nitty gritty, that's like at the almost user level concerns, but is the direction to like think of the, I don't know, to go in that direction?
so the idea is to absolutely enable us to do that.
Okay.
So that's sort of the stuff that would do that might live under the processing project. but the UI might have ways to talk to that stuff and have a way for somebody to say, actually, just always ignore this part of the page or whatever. So what we want to have in annotations is probably at some point there might be a few fields that are special, that the DB like knows something about, like significance or something. Whereas it goes through the pipeline, if some automated system goes like, this is a significance of 0 because it was an error code, or because the change occurred in a space that it knows is a part of the page we don't give a crap about.
I'm just realizing that annotations are not just for people,
Exactly.
but also like the machine will be using them later. So that's clarifying. Cool.
Yeah. We want annotations to sort of be the abstract way that anything can describe a change, and maybe describe that change for other things. So it might be a mechanism of just describing the page as analysts currently do, but it might also be a mechanism of sort of pre-describing a page for an analyst or for another system that's doing some other kind of analysis or whatever. Yeah. Yeah. So to roll all the way back to this idea of annotations, being across arbitrary sets of 2 versions. So we had. Ooh, did I lose it? Okay. I lost track of. Sorry. Right. Okay. So versions, annotations. So we had, sort of this version that had 5 annotations kind of hanging off of it between this version and its previous one. So before 783 versus 6397. And that same version also has an annotation before 783. So this is ending at the same version, but it's coming from an earlier one, 47F5, right? So this annotation you won't see in this list of annotations. Just close this. And you won't see any of those annotations in this list, right? They're, like we said, totally divergent sets.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So you can kind of see that in action here. So that's pages, versions, changes. So to see this kind of in action, if we wanted to add a new annotation here, this is my local DB. So do I have Postman open? I don't. So we can use a little HTTP client to make a post, because I haven't built a fancy form for this yet. So if you've ever used it, Postman is a reasonably convenient little client that gives you a nice user interface to just make HTTP requests. And since I have to do authorization, it's a little nicer to do it this way than on curl on the command line. So
I don't suppose. Actually, sorry. This is a question about future things, tasks. So.
Okay. I'll just go through this super quick. So it's the same URL we went to look at the list of annotations, except instead of a GET request, we just make a POST request. And you can just use basic auth and update that. And then this is just a JSON object with anything you want, right? So I could say significance, and we were thinking this field might be like 0 to 1, so like we're not sure, or like we think it's pretty significant, maybe it's 0.75 or something. I could say like subject climate.
Just FYI though, I can't see that window that you're using. I don't.
Oh,
It's just sharing Chrome.
okay.
That's okay. Okay, like
Hold
I
on.
think if you
Aha.
unshare and then reshare, if you want me to
Yep.
see it.
I think. How about
Yeah,
this?
yeah.
Actually, I just realized in the giant list of windows that comes up, desktop is one of them. This should work all around now.
Cool.
Um, so, so this is the same URL that we were just looking at. So
Mhm.
actually, let me flip back. If we just make a GET request to that URL, we'll see that
Yeah,
same response, right?
yeah.
Um, so if we make a POST request, and we have to make sure that we're logged in, and then it can be anything we want. Right? Just the annotations are just totally freeform. So if we just send this, we'll get back
Yeah.
that annotation. So we'll see that it made annotation. It has a UID, it has my author ID, and it's got that data in it. And if we go
Yeah.
back to get the list of annotations there, now we'll see that there are two.
Woo.
There's the previous one, and then the one we just made. So
Cool.
that's how annotations work.
Awesome.
And that is sort of the main stuff about DB. There's some new things in a current PR that's almost done that add query parameters so you can filter your list of pages by agency or site or capture time. And sort of the same thing for versions. You can filter versions by hash or source type or capture time. So some actually intelligent, useful searching and filtering.
Cool. So sorry, you were just saying there's like some query parameters for filtering,
Yeah. So
and
if
we don't.
you're
I was just clarifying, like if you don't think that they're worth digging into, I totally understand that. Um,
um,
speaking of this, like, is it has there been talk of? Would it be helpful if I like or someone put together like a YAML file for defining like the Swagger spec, like defining it related to Swagger, is that like a thing that has been tossed around, or Open API?
uh, Swagger could work great. Nothing has really been talked about in depth. What I wanted to do, whether we do it with Swagger or something else, is to make the front page of DB. If you go there with a web browser and you request it, with HTML,
Yeah,
you'll get back a description of the API, with a little introductory thing about what DB is, and then API listing. So it's sort of
yeah.
like, here's how you use this thing.
The great part about, like, I guess I've done like just with a couple other projects, like just like you don't even need the cooperation of the developers as long as it's like uh can like I could just write the YAML thing, host it somewhere else, even host the UI for browsing
Mhm.
somewhere else, and add a little proxy that allows like cores, and basically like it doesn't have to tread on any plans, and whenever you guys feel like adding the uh, the official like index page being like a UI, you just kind of point it to the YAML or the JSON file. um, yeah,
Yeah.
so I wouldn't think it would interfere with anything, but it might make the like exploration part much more possible uh, without getting on a call with you, sort of thing. Like, um,
Sure.
yeah. But I don't want to work on it if you don't think it's a useful. Sorry, I said I wasn't going to get into like tasks or next step, so I'll step back and like allow you to continue.
I mean, I'll just say, like, briefly, that is the kind of help I would love to have. And whether you want to do it separately or as a PR into DB, so that it just becomes the DB front page, um, either way is great. I mean, I think it
Okay.
would be better if we just integrated it right with the DB, because that way, if people point their browser to it to figure out what it is, like, it's just right there. It's like, hey, here's the table of contents. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Uh,
but I'd love to have you make that PR and start working on it.
cool.
So, yeah.
Um, and Awesome. So, but I feel like I still cut you off. So,
Okay.
uh,
I was just going to briefly say, especially if you're interested in that, the PR that's developing all those queries is 41, which is titled "Add Some Query String Filters."
yeah.
Yeah, so it should be easy to find. Like the previous one, way down near the bottom, because discussion got complicated, there's the large sort of summary post that says like, here's what is here so far and what we still have questions about. So actually the place to start is this post way down here at the bottom. But you can see that pages you can filter by site, by agency, and by URL, which is actually a pattern. So you don't have to have an exact URL. You can say, you know, like nasa.gov/star to get all the nasa.gov pages. And you can also filter by capture time, which is actually the capture time of any versions that it has. And then versions you can filter by hash, by source type, and by capture time.
Okay. Is there, would it make sense? Like, are there kind of like owners or like, do you guys, do each of you feel like one part of this is like kind of like your baby and you're maybe the more go-to person? Like it seems, my impression is DB is the one that you are working really closely on. Is anyone else working on the UI or the processing one? Like,
so the reality is like the group of people working on this is really small. And DB is sort of mostly my thing. But I try not to merge anything without somebody else at least taking a look at it and going, seems sane. You know, and I would love for this community to grow so that it feels less like my thing. But yeah, I would say DB is sort of, it is 99% my work. Dan is sort of coordinating stuff, and he sort of also owns processing. UI is a thing that there have been a bunch of UI in similar projects that people just like made in a few hours or a weekend and threw up, but didn't really stick with. Kevin has sort of kind of stuck with it, but he's been in and out. He's been moving and has had a whole bunch of other personal things going on, so he hasn't been able to participate as much. But it's also kind of depended on all this DB work, which is only now becoming more solid. And so hopefully that'll pick up more. And I think that is between that and DB, well, I don't know. I think there's lots of places for people to come in and help. So I don't want to say there's one place where everything's going to pick up. But so he's sort of the point person on that, but nobody has really been giving focused effort to UI yet.
Okay, cool. And just this other kind of thought that's floating there is like what pieces are, because my impression is that that the actual data from this is kind of like not a huge number of eyes, just because it's kind of going into the making of press releases, which kind of want to have a bit of a splash. But I'm just trying to think how like just in terms of like attracting larger community members, there's like often having a front facing thing that like can be explored and seen and understood, like is useful to like pulling people in and making them understand, like helping them understand, like I'm just trying to reconcile like the fact that not everyone can be invited into the UI to see how the app works and like understand the value, but that seems like an important way to like bring in a community. If it's not until like they've been working for a couple weeks before they're actually kind of initiated in to see like all the value that's happening on the back end, and like that's a hard sell, or like a hard thing to hook people into. I'm not sure if I'm being clear. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. Like,
well, so I might not be totally sure where you're going with it, but like I'm hearing a couple things in there, which are, you know, it's hard for people to sort of see what's going on in all of this, but also hard for people to get involved in participating. And on the latter point, one of the goals of all of this is that if we don't have to be able to trust people with logins to a system Edgy is paying for anymore, it's way easier to just allow lots of people to go at it. And we don't have to feel like somebody's got to be really trusted before they get a login to the system and they can help be analysts.
Do you think like, is that like, I think I maybe misunderstood. There's no, I thought it had to be like kind of trusted folks, not just because these are services we're paying for, but because the information that's being gathered is like building, like, I don't know, like a little bit of like you're building something that maybe is a scoop for like journalists, or I don't know. I'm just, like you don't think there's going to be any issue with like kind of having opener access once the system is more owned by us?
No, I think everybody wants that.
Okay.
I don't think,
Cool.
I mean, this is much more a conversation for, say, Andy and Matt and Toli, who are more on the organizational side and have been running this monitoring project since, December when they started. To say that, but the understanding I get from them is they're not concerned about having a scoop. Their goal is to do the work and provide information to news agencies about this stuff because it's easy to miss it in the deluge of changes and things going on. Their goal is to provide a space that sort of rigorously and regularly does the monitoring work. And it's not about being first or having a scoop or being quiet until we know something that we can say. It's about having a space to reliably and rigorously do that work. And if we can involve more people in it, that's a good thing. And there is probably a concern about like random people coming in and just like throwing stupid annotations that they haven't thought through on there, which is part of the reason there's still an idea of having a login to this system. But hopefully we won't have to be as worried about any particular individual. And because we know who made every annotation, if somebody shows up who's a bad actor, we can sort of ignore their annotations. And if we get more people participating, maybe there's just a third level of review to figure out whether something's significant or not. And that's fine. It'll probably be better in the long run.
So can you imagine this like a read-only version of like the inside of this app being visible to just whoever's curious to like see the guts of this project and the efforts that are going on? Like, is that?
Oh, that is the intent already right now.
Okay.
That's why you can read data out of the API without logging in. The only thing you have to log in is to make an annotation. Or to add users also requires a login. You can't add other people.
That's okay. That's super cool. I wasn't clear on that before. I think even you would
the
explain
whole point is to be transparent with this, right? And in theory, any news organization.
I was just like, there's a real like I get that it's a real value in journalism. I think you already explained, and it was clarified to me, like that these are press releases going out on the wire. But there is like this like a little bit more of when journalists feel like they're getting a scoop, like it sucks for my wishes for transparency. But my understanding is that they run harder with that new information and story, and they push it more when it's just theirs and they have ownership over it. So it's like, it feels like a real tension that like I was like prepared to like kind of accept and navigate in this space. But it sounds like it's not, I get to totally indulge the transparency loving side and don't have to navigate that tension of the scoop in this scenario. But I would totally understand if that was a pressure. Like,
well, I would say this. I mean, it's easy to fall into the space where you're worried about that. But the reality is, having looked at this so far, that it's so boring, really, that you still have this scoop by virtue of just having had this process through which we stick with it and do the work, right? Like, we're not monitoring anything that's not already publicly available. We're not doing anything that anybody else couldn't cobble together their own tools to do in their own newsroom. But Washington Post is seemingly, writing all kinds of articles and getting benefit from our reports because they only have so many reporters to do the work. They've got so many things going on, and they are more than likely not going to catch 9 out of 10 or even 99 out of 100 of the sort of changes we are, until somebody like us alerts them to it. So, like, it makes sense to worry about the scoop aspect, but in a practical reality, it's not actually something to worry about.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So, and I think a big part of the whole goal is to keep this very transparent, so that when we do publish a report that says, hey, these changes of this sort of character happened across all these pages over the last week, any news organization that wants to look into that deeply can go right back to DB or to the UI or to whatever, right? So people could write all kinds of tools against DB for just pulling up those sorts of changes and reviewing them themselves, right? And maybe connecting those to other things that they've seen outside of what we're doing. So DB is separate from UI, both because it's a little bit of a separate technical concern, but also it enables it to be used as a sort of like archival and verification space, not just an analysis space.
Makes sense.
You know, so, yeah.
Cool. Do you think there's anything else to like touch on?
I feel like that's a good overview of all these projects. But
this is
if
wonderful.
you have questions, I want to answer them because my head has been focused in here for the last few weeks. So I might be missing I might be glossing over something that's confusing but totally obvious to me.
I think I kind of asked the questions that I wanted to ask going through. The one about Swagger was kind of, no, I think that's, I think I pretty much wrote everything that was coming into my head and asked it at some points. Is there other places where, like, I found, like places where tasks for the project overall are discussed? There's like, do you guys kind of keep in the edgy gov data archiving overview, there's a tag for monitoring that has like maybe 2. But it didn't seem like it was very active. It kind of seemed like it was very super high level. Maybe only Don's kind of tracking it there. And then you guys have your own kind of almost overview repository. And the last one is like the very specific to the tools ones that are the issue queues for the repos themselves. Are those like the 3 levels that you guys track issues? Are there any other task places that I should be aware of?
That and Slack.
Slack.
Yeah. So I would say we don't necessarily do too much that's web monitoring specific on that edgy overview repo. And I think mainly that really is Dawn sort of using that as the space to coordinate at the super high level. And for the most part, sort of Dan and Kevin and I and other people are working in the web-monitoring repo or in the actual software project repos under that.
Okay.
So most of the coordination happens through issues on those smaller repos. And then there's a lot of discussion about things on Slack. But
is it worth?
Sorry.
Oh, so, I know we want to encourage people to sign up and come into the Slack, and I don't want to suggest something that like relieves that pressure, but is there like there's a tool that I'm trying to use on some of the other Slacks that I'm using that essentially keeps a public log that's world readable, that's like can be linked to, and when I've used things like it for other projects, it's kind of nice, like issue queues. It's like, here's the text context and you can link to it. And like, I don't know. I mean, most people are going to be signed up for Slack, so it's no big deal, but like, it's nice to have something that's like, this tool is called slackarchive.io.
Okay.
it's kind of just a little bot that like any channel you invite it into, it now just starts keeping a public log. Do you think might that align with, do you imagine that being okay, or that's kind of seeing resistance because like the sorts of conversations that happen in the web monitoring space, like would people be opposed to like having public logs or open to it? By the way, this is just like asking for your feedback. It's not like asking for a decision. Uh,
I think that's something people are very opposed to it. Yeah, there
I
are
think
people there said that would not be a big deal. That would be fine.
okay. I lost you a little connection wise there, but I think I got it.
Okay.
um,
Uh, have you got me now? Are we
I
back?
do. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. I mean, for me personally, and I think my temperature gauge on other people is that would probably be fine, maybe even good and valuable. So, yeah, I think that's totally okay. You know, you should
Okay.
definitely ask, but I think it's fine.
Okay. The good thing is it's like per channel, so it doesn't have to be imposed on every space. It's just like hey, we're not talking. We don't feel we're talking about privileged things here, and
Mm-hmm.
why not?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think pretty much everything in the archivers Slack is considered to be pretty public.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. And out of do you are you? I sometimes forget you're an edgy as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And do you tend to do you tend like how does your brain work in terms of deciding what goes in where? Do you tend to normally go in archivers and it's just when you need to go into edgy and that's a separate space, or is it more nuanced?
For me, and this is probably largely because the team of analysts all does their work and discussion in the Edgy Slack. I tend to treat the archiver Slack as the place for software discussions, and the Edgy Slack is the place for sort of like larger team the project of monitoring things, not the project of the DB software sort of
Okay.
discussion. And where those intersect, I sort of have the same conversation in both places.
Yeah.
But yeah, I view archivers as sort of the place for software project discussion, and Edgy as the place for sort of like the work of monitoring discussion.
Okay, cool. That's helpful. I'm still trying to navigate my brain hasn't had a clear line, so it's a little bit of overhead to to think through. But I'm sure it'll come.
I think there's also a sense that the Edgy Slack is it's not non-public, but it's less public. Like it's a little bit more of a everybody here we've gotten to know, and we're comfortable with having slightly more sensible discussion, slightly more sensitive discussions with sort of space.
Yeah, which is important.
Yeah.
Okay, no, I think I can't think of anything else, Rob. But this is super helpful, and I took up way more time than I was expecting.
Oh, no worries.
But so I confirmed that this is recording. Don had me a little worried that sometimes these just go into oblivion, but like I think it's going to be there, so I can like. I will put any objection if I just put it on YouTube. Who knows if either of us want to link it or drop it any other time? It might be helpful for people.
Yeah, no, that would be great, because then we can just post it in Slack, and anytime somebody has a question, we can sort of, here's the overview.
Speaking of which, whatever, this will be on it. People can always just stop watching now. Is there like an archivers YouTube account, or I don't know if I don't feel as I can liberally like put random videos onto the Edgy channel, but do you know, is there a place that you can, or I could just keep it on my personal for now until we get it sorted, but
I have no idea.
Okay, cool.
I don't know one way or the other at all.
I will find out then. Thanks though, man.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
All right.
See you. Have a good weekend.
You too.